A millionaire gave the homeless mother a bank card. However, the next day when he reviewed the camera, he was furious to see the rain unexpectedly arrived, drenching the streets of Austin in an unrelenting cascade. It hammered against the windshield of Matthew's sleek black sedan, the rhythmic thrum of the wipers struggling to clear his view. Streetlights glistened against puddles on the pavement, their flickering reflections distorted by the storm. Inside the car, the world felt muted, except for the constant buzz of Matthew's thoughts. The dashboard clock glowed a sharp 7:42 p.m., ticking down toward the critical meeting. It wasn't just another corporate pitch. It was a presentation that could expand his global enterprise. He rehearsed points in his mind, his lips twitching as if forming words. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter as he navigated the rain-slicked streets. Then he saw her. The headlights caught a frail figure hunched beneath a faltering streetlight. A woman cradled something close to her chest. No, someone. A child, swaddled in a tattered blanket that did little against the rain. Her shoulders were trembling, her soaked hair plastered to her face as she struggled to shield the child from the storm's merciless grip. Matthew's jaw tightened, his foot hesitating on the accelerator. "Keep driving. You don't have time for this." His gaze flicked to the glowing red light ahead, then back to his watch. The meeting was less than an hour away, yet his eyes returned to the woman. A car sped past her, spraying a wave of muddy water onto the sidewalk. She recoiled, clutching the child closer. For a moment, Matthew thought she might collapse. He sighed, a low, frustrated sound. His fingers drummed against the leather wheel. "You don't know her? Someone else will stop." The light turned green, and he began to ease forward, but the scene stayed with him, etched like a ghostly imprint on his mind. The way she stood, her thin arms curling protectively around the bundle, a silent cry of desperation in her posture. Before he realized it, his foot slammed on the brake. The car skidded slightly, the tires protesting against the wet road. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, shifting into reverse. The rain lashed against his windows as he pulled to the curb near the woman. He rolled down the passenger side window, immediately hit by the cold sting of rain. "Excuse me," his voice had to rise above the downpour. "Do you need help?" The woman turned, startled, her eyes wide and wary. Beneath the dripping strands of her hair, Matthew could see her face, pale and gaunt, with a kind of fragility that spoke of exhaustion and fear. Her arms clutched the child tighter, and she took a half step back. I don't... Her voice was faint, barely audible over the rain. Her lips quivered as she glanced at the car, then at the bundle in her arms. The baby, swaddled so tightly its face was barely visible, stirred and let out a soft, plaintive wail. "You can't stay out here in this," Matthew said, his tone firm but not unkind. He leaned across the seat, opening the door slightly. "Get in. You'll catch your death." For a moment, she hesitated, her grip tightening on the child as her gaze flickered between him and the empty street. The rain continued its relentless assault, drenching her further. Finally, her resolve broke, and she stepped forward, her movements stiff and deliberate, as though any sudden action might shatter her. Matthew grabbed a coat from the passenger seat and draped it over the woman as she climbed in, careful not to jostle the baby. Water pooled around her feet on the pristine leather floor mats. She muttered a hoarse, "Thank you," her voice barely audible. As Matthew drove, he cast sidelong glances at her. She was still trembling, her knuckles white as they gripped the edge of the coat. The baby's cries had softened to faint whimpers, muffled by the damp fabric of the blanket. "What's your name?" Matthew asked after a long silence. "Emma," she said quietly. Her voice was strained, as if the word itself took great effort. "And this is Pamela." "Well, Emma," Matthew said, his tone softening despite himself. "We're going to get you somewhere warm. A hospital, maybe." Her gaze darted toward him, wary but grateful. "Thank you," she said again, her words trembling in the same way her body did. As they drove through the rain-soaked city, Matthew felt an unfamiliar weight settle over him. His world had always been calculated, every decision measured against its outcome, yet here he was, veering off course entirely for a stranger. His fingers tightened on the wheel. The hospital came into view, its bright lights hazy through the rain. Matthew pulled up to the entrance, stepping out to help Emma and Pamela. The rain soaked him instantly, but he hardly noticed. As Emma disappeared inside with the nurse, Matthew lingered at the entrance, the cold air sharp against his skin. He looked back at the glowing lights of his car, his meeting long forgotten. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he knew his life had just shifted. The fluorescent lights of the hospital cast a cold, unrelenting glow over the waiting area. The hum of machines, the shuffle of nurses' footsteps, and the occasional muffled sob from distant corners filled the air. Matthew sat stiffly in a plastic chair, his damp jacket draped over the seat beside him. Emma cradled Pamela with both arms across from him, as if releasing her, even slightly, might allow the world to swallow them both. Pamela's soft whimpers broke the stillness. Emma gently rocked Pamela, whispering soothing words that barely reached the level of a whisper. The baby quieted, her tiny face peeking out from the now dry blanket Matthew had grabbed from his car earlier. Emma's eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in every shadow and every stranger. She flinched as a nurse called out a name, not hers, and disappeared through a swinging door. Matthew noticed the way Emma's fingers curled protectively around the child, how her knuckles turned white. The bruises along her wrist, half concealed by the frayed cuffs of her jacket, didn't escape him either. Nor did the faint lines of exhaustion etched deeply into her face. She wasn't much older than 30, yet the weight she carried made her seem far older. "They'll see you soon," he said, his voice low, careful not to startle her. Emma nodded without meeting his gaze. Her lips moved as though to form words, but none came. Instead, she adjusted the blanket around Pamela, her movements deliberate, almost rehearsed. A nurse finally emerged, clipboard in hand. "Miss White, the doctor's ready for you." Emma hesitated, her body tensing. She glanced toward Matthew, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. He gave a small nod, standing to help. "I'll wait here," he said. "Take your time." She hesitated again, then rose, clutching Pamela close as if bracing against a gust of wind. Her uneven steps followed the nurse down the hallway, leaving Matthew standing alone under the stark hospital lights. Time dragged in the waiting room. Matthew's watch read 9:23 p.m., but he barely registered the passing minutes. His mind replayed the moments from the street. Emma's drenched figure, the sheer desperation in her voice. He didn't know her story, not yet, but the fragments he'd glimpsed painted enough of a picture to unsettle him. When Emma returned, Pamela nestled quietly in her arms. The exhaustion on her face had deepened. She eased into the chair across from him, her movements slow and deliberate. "Everything all right?" Matthew asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. He kept his tone measured, avoiding any trace of pity. "They said she's okay," Emma murmured, her voice barely audible. "Just hungry and tired." "I'll be fine too." Matthew didn't believe her, but he let the lie hang in the air. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the hospital swirled around them, an ever-present reminder of where they were. Finally, Emma broke the silence, her words hesitant, like she was testing the strength of ice beneath her feet. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she began, her gaze fixed on the tiled floor. "I didn't know where else to go." Matthew leaned forward slightly, careful not to crowd her. What happened? Her fingers tightened around Pamela's blanket. "It's complicated," she said, her voice shaking. My... She paused, her breath hitching as though the word itself hurt. "My husband. He wasn't always like this." Although she did not provide further details, the subtle trembling in her hands conveyed a powerful message. The way her shoulders hunched forward, her body as though bracing for an unseen blow, it all told Matthew more than her words could. "He gambles," she said finally, her voice flat. "Drinks. And when things go bad, he gets angry." Matthew didn't press her, letting the words come in their own time. Her story unfolded in fragments, like a photograph torn into pieces and scattered, marked in temper, the mounting debts, the isolation. And finally, the moment he threw her and Pamela out with nothing but a handful of belongings. "I couldn't stay," she whispered. "Not with Pamela." Her voice cracked on her daughter's name, and Matthew saw the raw ache beneath her stoicism. The protective wall she'd built around herself wavered, if only for a moment. He recognized the quiet strength she needed to leave, to keep moving despite the odds against her. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her gaze snapping to his. "You didn't have to do this. I'll find a way to pay you back." "You don't have to," Matthew said simply. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet and extracting his credit card. He held it out, his expression resolute. "For whatever you need here." Emma froze, staring at the card as if it was something foreign. "I can't." "You can," Matthew interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's for Pamela. And for you." Her hand hovered before she finally took it, her fingers brushing his for the briefest second. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and reluctance. Matthew sat back, watching as she cradled Pamela closer. He didn't say anything more, but the decision was already made. Whatever had brought Emma and Pamela into his life, he wasn't about to turn away. In the sterile glow of the hospital, the seeds of something unspoken began to take root. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle by the time Matthew's car pulled into the long driveway of his home. The motion-activated lights flickered on, illuminating the sprawling modern estate. Glass walls and clean architectural lines gleamed under the muted glow, the manicured garden glistening with rainwater. It was a house designed to impress, but tonight it felt strangely hollow. Matthew turned off the engine and glanced at Emma in the passenger seat. She sat stiffly, clutching Pamela, who had drifted into a fitful sleep. The baby's small fist peeked out from the blanket, her delicate fingers curling and uncurling. Emma's damp hair clung to her face, and her eyes darted nervously around the unfamiliar surroundings. "It's not much," Matthew said, breaking the silence. His attempt at levity felt flat, even to him. "But it's dry." Emma didn't respond right away. Her gaze lingered on the towering glass structure ahead, its stark elegance a world away from the chaotic streets she had fled. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words seemed heavy with reluctance. Matthew stepped out, grabbing an umbrella from the back seat. By the time he opened the passenger door, Emma was already halfway out, Pamela cradled tightly against her chest. The rain, light as it was now, still seemed to make her flinch. Matthew held the umbrella over them as they made their way to the front door. Walter, Matthew's housekeeper, was waiting. A tall man with graying hair and a calm, composed demeanor. He opened the door with practiced efficiency. His sharp eyes quickly assessed the situation. Emma's disheveled state, the baby in her arms, the subtle tension in Matthew's usually unreadable expression. Without a word, Walter stepped aside to let them in. "The guest house is ready," Walter said after a brief pause. "I've made sure it's warm and stocked." "Thanks, Walter," Matthew replied. He glanced at Emma. "It's quieter there. You'll have your own space." Emma hesitated, looking around the expansive foyer. The marble floors reflected the warm light from the chandelier above. The sheer size of the place seemed to make her uneasy, her grip on Pamela tightening. "That's very kind," she said, her voice barely audible. Walter gave her a gentle nod, his tone reassuring. "It's no trouble at all, ma'am. If you need anything, just let me know." The guest house was smaller, cozier, but still far from modest. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a small courtyard, and soft lamplight gave the space a warm glow. Emma stepped inside cautiously, her damp shoes leaving faint marks on the polished wood floors. Matthew set a bag of essentials he'd picked up on the way from the hospital near the door. "There's a kitchen stocked with basics, and the bathroom has fresh towels," he said. "If Pamela needs anything, just call." Emma's eyes scanned the room, its pristine furniture, the carefully arranged decor. It felt like a sanctuary, yet her body remained tense, her shoulders hunched as if expecting something to go wrong. She placed Pamela gently on the bed, her hands lingering on the baby's blanket for a moment too long. "Thank you," she said again, glancing at Matthew. Her tone was sincere but guarded. Matthew nodded, sensing her discomfort. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said, stepping toward the door. "Walter's around if you need anything." As the door clicked shut, Emma exhaled deeply. Her eyes darted to the windows, the locks, the shadows that stretched across the room. She moved to the curtains and drew them closed, her movements brisk and deliberate. The faint sound of rain tapping against the glass filled the silence. A soft cooing sound broke the stillness. Emma turned to find Pamela stirring, her small hands reaching toward the ceiling. For the first time that night, a faint smile crossed Emma's lips. She leaned over and scooped Pamela into her arms, whispering something inaudible as the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around hers. The sound of a light knock startled her. She froze, her eyes narrowing toward the door before Matthew's voice called softly from the other side. "Forgot to mention," he said, his tone light. "Walter made tea. Figured you might want something warm." Emma hesitated before opening the door a crack. Matthew held out a steaming cup, his expression unreadable but gentle. "For you." She took it cautiously, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment. "Thank you," she said once more, her voice steadier this time. Matthew nodded. "Good night, Emma." As the door closed again, Emma stood there for a moment, the warmth of the tea radiating through the porcelain. She glanced at Pamela, now calm in her makeshift crib. For the first time in what felt like years, the weight on her chest lightened just enough for her to take a deep breath. Outside, Matthew paused on the path back to the main house. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and damp. He looked back at the guest house, its lights glowing faintly through the drawn curtains. Something about the stillness of the night felt fragile, as if any sudden movement could shatter it. Martin hadn't appeared yet, but the silence, Matthew thought, was rarely a sign of safety. The morning arrived quietly, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest house. Emma sat at the small dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Pamela lay peacefully in her crib nearby, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm. Yet, Emma's face remained tense, her eyes darting occasionally toward the window, as if expecting to see someone, or something, lurking beyond the glass. Matthew entered with measured footsteps, his knock soft against the frame of the open door. He carried a tray of pastries and fresh fruit, a disarming gesture despite the tension that hung in the room. "Thought you might like something to eat," he said. Emma looked up, her expression hesitant, before she nodded. Thank you. She took a slice of toast, nibbling at the corner without much appetite. Matthew settled across from her, his coffee untouched as he watched her carefully. You don't have to talk about anything you're not ready to, he said, his tone steady but non-intrusive. But I'm here to help. For a moment, Emma said nothing. Her fingers tapped lightly against the side of her mug, her gaze fixed on the steam curling upward. It's complicated, she finally said, her voice barely audible above a whisper. My life. My family. Matthew leaned back slightly, giving her space. He noticed how her posture stiffened as she spoke, how her hands trembled just enough to make the tea ripple in her mug. My father, Douglas, she continued after a pause, her tone laced with both bitterness and regret. He wasn't a good man. To a lot of people he was dangerous. Matthew didn't respond immediately, letting her words hang in the air. The quiet between them felt heavier now, filled with unspoken memories and shadows from her past. Dangerous how? He asked, his voice careful, free of judgment. Emma hesitated, her jaw tightening as if holding back a flood of words. He ran things, illegal things, she admitted. People feared him and hated him. He made enemies, enemies who don't forget. Matthew nodded slightly, processing her words. The name Douglas seemed familiar now, stirring faint memories of old news reports about organized crime in Austin. He didn't push for more, sensing the weight of what she had shared. But that's not who I am, Emma said suddenly, her voice firm despite its tremor. I've spent my whole life trying to be something different, to protect Pamela from everything I grew up around. Her words carried an urgency, a need for him to understand. Matthew saw it in the way her eyes met his, wide and pleading. You're not him, Matthew said simply, and you don't owe anyone an explanation for trying to keep your daughter safe. Emma looked down, her grip on the mug loosening slightly. Thank you, she murmured, for saying that. As the day stretched on, the calm began to fracture. Walter, ever attentive, noticed Emma's unease. She moved through the guest house with quiet efficiency, locking the doors and peering through the curtains at odd intervals. Her tension was palpable, though she said nothing about it. Late that evening, when the estate had settled into silence, Walter spotted Emma slipping out. She wore a long coat, her steps hurried but deliberate as she made her way toward the back gate. Walter followed at a distance, his sharp eyes tracking her movements until she disappeared into the darkened street. Returning quickly to the main house, Walter found Matthew in his study, papers spread across the large oak desk. Sir, Walter said, his tone low but urgent. Miss White has left the property. Matthew looked up, frowning. Alone? With Pamela? No, sir. The child is still in the guest house, but Miss White seemed distressed. Matthew stood, his mind racing. Did she say anything? Nothing, Walter replied, but the way she left, like she was running from something. Emma's absence stretched into the night. Matthew paced by the guest house, his worry growing with each passing hour. He glanced at the crib, where Pamela stirred slightly but remained asleep. The sight of her tiny form, vulnerable and unaware, only deepened his resolve. When Emma finally returned, her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with fear. She hesitated at the door, clutching the lapels of her coat as if they were the only things keeping her upright. Where were you? Matthew asked, his voice more concerned than angry. Emma looked away, her hands trembling. I just needed to clear my head. Clear your head? By disappearing in the middle of the night? His tone softened when he saw her flinch. Emma, you don't have to deal with this alone. She shook her head, stepping past him into the guest house. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. "If they find me, if they find Pamela." Matthew's chest tightened. "Who?" Emma turned, her expression a mix of guilt and desperation. "The people my father crossed. They won't stop until they've made him pay. And now, I'm their way to do it." As Emma retreated to Pamela's crib, her hands shaking as she adjusted the blanket, Matthew stood in the doorway. The picture was clearer now, though no less daunting. Emma wasn't just running from Martin. She was running from the ghosts of her father's past, ghosts that could become very real threats. Matthew's jaw set, his resolve hardening. Whatever dangers loomed, he wasn't about to let them reach her or Pamela. Not while they were under his roof. The bank's automated alert chimed on Matthew's phone as he sipped his morning coffee. At first, he thought nothing of it, distracted by the reports spread across his desk. But when the words "unusual activity" and "flagged transactions" blinked across the screen, his brow furrowed. "Walter," Matthew called, setting down his mug. The housekeeper appeared promptly, his composed demeanor as steady as ever. "Could you look at this?" Matthew handed him the phone, the email detailing charges from a high-end electronics store and a luxury boutique glaring back. Walter scanned the list. "Sir, these are substantial." His tone was neutral, but the implication was clear. Matthew's jaw tightened. He hadn't made these purchases. His mind raced to the possibilities, landing uncomfortably on the credit card he'd left for Emma at the hospital. He quickly called the bank and, after verifying his identity, requested details of the transactions. "The purchases were made in-store yesterday evening," the banker informed him, her voice brisk and professional. "We also have CCTV footage if you'd like to investigate further." "Send it to my email," Matthew instructed. When the footage arrived an hour later, Matthew stared at the screen. His stomach sank. Martin. The man strolled casually through the electronics store, picking out high-end items with the ease of someone spending someone else's money. Matthew's first instinct was frustration, but it was quickly tempered by confusion. How had Martin gotten access to the card? Did Emma give it to him? If so, why? He clenched his fists, his mind filled with a plethora of questions. Matthew didn't approach Emma immediately. Instead, he waited until the evening, when Pamela had settled into sleep. The guest house was dimly lit, its quiet warmth contrasting with the tension tightening his chest. He knocked softly on the door, and Emma answered, looking surprised to see him. "Matthew?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Can we talk?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Emma hesitated, but nodded. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Is something wrong?" Matthew didn't sit. He stood a few feet away, his gaze steady but not accusatory. "There's been some unusual activity on my credit card," he began. "Charges I didn't make." Her face paled. I don't understand." "I have footage from the bank," he said gently. "It shows Martin using the card." Emma's breath hitched, and her hands flew to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "No, he can't." Matthew watched her carefully, her reaction raw and unfiltered. "Did you give him the card?" he asked, his tone more concerned than accusatory. Her head snapped up, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't want to," she choked out. "But he found me." Matthew's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "He showed up," she said, her voice trembling. "When I snuck out the other night, he was waiting." She gripped the armrest of the couch as if steadying herself. "He said, if I didn't give him something, anything, he'd take Pamela. He'd take her away from me." Her words came in fragments, punctuated by shallow breaths. "I didn't know what to do. I thought if I gave him the card, he'd leave us alone. Matthew felt the anger simmer in his veins, not at Emma, but at Martin, at the man who could reduce her to this state, trembling and broken, trying to protect her child with no tools, but desperation. "You should have told me," Matthew said, his voice soft but firm. "I could have helped." Emma shook her head. "I was scared," she admitted, her tears spilling over. "I didn't want to drag you into this. You've already done so much." Matthew knelt in front of her, his voice steady. "Listen to me, Emma. This isn't just your fight anymore. Martin has crossed a boundary, and he has no intention of stopping. But you're not alone in this." Her shoulders sagged, and she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." Matthew placed a reassuring hand on hers, his grip firm but gentle. "We'll fix this," he said, "but I need you to trust me. No more hiding." She nodded, her tears still falling. "I do trust you," she whispered. I don't know how to stop being afraid." Matthew stayed with her a while longer, the silence between them heavy, but comforting. There aren't many fairy tales about a man like Matthew in real life, but everyone wishes for a miracle like Emma's. Leave a comment, "Angel," if you are wishing for the same as ours. He'd never been in a situation like this, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let Martin or anyone else hurt Emma and Pamela again. His mind was already buzzing with plans as he departed from the guest house that night. He would deal with Martin, and he would ensure that Emma and Pamela were safe. Whatever it took, he wouldn't let fear win. The morning brought a deceptive sense of calm. Sunlight glinted off the windows of Matthew's estate, illuminating the manicured gardens and casting warm streaks across the polished floors. But Walter, sharp-eyed and cautious as always, noticed the black sedan parked across the street. It had been there since dawn, its engine silent, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Walter stepped onto the porch, a cloth in hand, as if to clean an already spotless railing, and studied the car with quiet intensity. Something about it felt off. By mid-morning, two men loitered near the edge of the property. They moved casually, leaning against a lamppost and talking in low tones, but their occasional glances toward the estate betrayed their interest. Walter's unease deepened. In the guest house, Emma sat on the floor beside Pamela's crib, her hands busy folding a small pile of laundry. But her mind was elsewhere. Her movements were mechanical, and her gaze flickered to the window every few minutes. Matthew entered quietly, his presence grounding. He carried a plate of sandwiches and set it on the table. "Walter mentioned you didn't eat breakfast," he said, his tone light but observant. Emma forced a small smile. "Thank you," she said, but didn't reach for the food. Her hand stilled on the laundry, and she looked at him, something unspoken hanging in the air. Matthew pulled up a chair, his movements deliberate and calm. "What's on your mind?" Emma hesitated, her eyes darting toward the curtained window before settling back on him. "When I was young," she began slowly, "I used to think my father was invincible. He had this presence, like nothing could touch him." Matthew leaned forward slightly, his expression open and encouraging. He didn't interrupt. But that power he had, it came from fear, from controlling people. Her voice faltered, but she pressed on, and people don't forget when someone takes everything from them. Her hands clenched the fabric of a small onesie. "I didn't understand back then, but now I see the damage he caused, and now it's following me." "Emma," Matthew said gently, "whatever your father did, it's not your burden to bear." She let out a bitter laugh. "Try telling that to the people he crossed. They don't care who I am. All they see is his blood." Her voice broke, and she shook her head. "Martin wasn't just after money. He wasn't acting alone. Matthew's expression darkened. "What do you mean?" Emma hesitated, as though speaking the words might solidify the danger. He said he'd been approached by people who knew about my father. Martin said they wanted to bribe him with our address. Matthew's mind raced. Martin had been coerced, used as a tool to draw Emma out. The men outside, the parked car, they weren't coincidences. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" he asked, his voice firm, but not harsh. Emma's eyes brimmed with tears. "Because I didn't want to believe it, and because I was scared. For Pamela. For you." Matthew stood, his jaw tightening. "You're not fighting this alone anymore," he said, "and whoever these people are, they won't touch you or Pamela." Later that afternoon, Walter found Matthew in the study. The housekeeper's usual composed demeanor was tinged with unease. "The car is still there," Walter said, "and the men haven't left the street." Matthew looked up from his desk, his expression hardening. "How long?" "Since this morning," Walter replied. "I also received a call." The voice on the other end said nothing, but stayed on the line long enough to unsettle the staff. Matthew nodded, his mind calculating. "Call the security company. I want extra patrols around the property." "Already done, sir," Walter said. "But I thought you should know. One of the men outside matches the description of someone linked to Douglas's old associates." The implication was clear. The ghosts of Emma's past weren't just looming, they were closing in. As night fell, the tension in the house became palpable. Shadows moved outside, faint but deliberate, visible from the second-floor windows. The hum of the estate's security cameras was a low, constant reminder of the precautions being taken. Emma sat with Pamela on the couch, holding her daughter close. Her gaze was distant, her body taut with unease. Matthew joined her, sitting a respectful distance away. "They're getting closer, aren't they?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew didn't lie. "Yes." She nodded, her grip on Pamela tightening. "I knew they'd find me eventually. I didn't think it would be this fast." Matthew's voice was steady. "We'll handle it. You're not alone in this." The words brought a fleeting sense of comfort, but the reality remained. The danger was real, and it was at their doorstep. The next morning, the black sedan was gone, but a sense of foreboding lingered. Matthew and Walter discussed the next steps in hushed tones, both aware that the temporary reprieve wouldn't last. In the guest house, Emma glanced out the window and saw nothing. No car, no loitering figures. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Matthew's estate was enveloped in a cool stillness, as if nature itself was retaining its breath. Emma watched Pamela toddle across the garden, her small hands reaching for dandelions that swayed in the breeze. For a moment, the scene felt almost serene. Almost. But Emma's smile faltered every time she glanced toward the perimeter walls, her mind replaying the ominous shadows and strange calls of the previous days. Even the vibrant flowers dotting the landscape seemed muted under the weight of her unease. Matthew approached, his movements quiet but deliberate, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. "She's a curious one," he remarked, nodding toward Pamela, who was now giggling at a butterfly. "She is," Emma said, her voice soft, her eyes never leaving her daughter. "It's the only thing keeping me grounded right now." Matthew handed her a cup and sat on the bench beside her, keeping a measured distance. "The security team has reinforced the property," he said, his tone casual but purposeful. "Cameras, guards, and patrols. No one's getting near without us knowing." Emma nodded, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Thank you," she whispered. "But they're not like normal people. They're persistent." Matthew looked at her, his gaze steady. What do you mean? Across town, in the dim confines of an abandoned warehouse, Martin stood, with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His face was pale, his usual swagger diminished. The two men before him radiated an unsettling calm. Older, sharp-dressed, their expressions unreadable. "You're sure she's there?" one of them asked, his voice low and even, though the weight behind it was unmistakable. "Yes," Martin said quickly, his voice cracked, betraying his fear. "She's staying at some guy's house. Big estate, lots of guards. Hard to get to." The second man, slightly shorter with a silver pocket watch in hand, smiled faintly. "Guards don't concern us, Martin. Although you've been useful, your effectiveness is diminishing." Martin swallowed hard. "I told you where she is. Isn't that enough?" The taller man leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing. "Do you know what your father-in-law cost us?" His voice carried venom, quiet but lethal. "Douglas didn't just take money. He took control. He humiliated us. And when he disappeared, we were left cleaning up his mess." The shorter man clicked his pocket watch shut, "And now we have the means to finish what he started. Through his bloodline." Martin raised his hands defensively. "I didn't sign up for that. I just wanted the money." "And you got it," the taller man said sharply. "But don't forget, Martin, if you try to run, you'll wish we left Douglas' daughter to deal with you instead." Martin nodded frantically, his throat dry. "I won't run. Just don't drag me any deeper into this." The shorter man smirked. "That's not up to you anymore. Back at the estate." Emma took a deep breath. "These people, my father's enemies, they don't give up. If they know I'm here, they'll find a way in. They don't care who they hurt." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Then they'll have to get through me first." His words were resolute, but Emma shook her head. "You don't understand what they're capable of. My father, he wasn't just a criminal. He controlled people, ruined lives. And when he left chaos behind. These men, they're the ones who climbed out of that chaos, and they've spent years nursing their grudges." Matthew placed a hand on hers, his grip firm. "Emma, I know the danger is real, but so is my promise to keep you and Pamela safe." She looked at him, her expression caught between gratitude and despair. "I don't want you getting hurt because of me." "That's not your decision," Matthew said simply. "We'll face this together." As dusk settled, the estate felt quieter than usual. Emma put Pamela to bed, her every movement deliberate, as though the night itself demanded caution. Matthew stood on the balcony of the main house, scanning the grounds. Walter joined him, his presence as steady as ever. "They've been quiet today," Walter said, his voice low. "Too quiet," Matthew replied. His eyes lingered on the darkened perimeter. "It's the calm before the storm." Walter nodded. "I'll double the patrols tonight." "Good," Matthew said, though the weight in his voice betrayed his unease. Meanwhile, the black sedan returned, parked just beyond the estate's boundary. Inside, Martin sat in the passenger seat, his leg bouncing nervously. "You're sure this will work?" he asked the driver, who remained silent. The driver turned slightly, revealing the sharp profile of one of Douglas's enemies. "It's not about working," he said coolly. "It's about sending a message." Martin slumped back in his seat, the reality sinking in. Whatever came next, he had unleashed forces far beyond his control. In the guest house, Emma sat by the window, watching the shadows stretch across the garden. The silence felt oppressive, heavy with the promise of something imminent. She turned her gaze to Pamela, asleep in her crib, her small face peaceful. Emma's whisper broke the stillness. "I won't let them take you." The estate's silence felt unnatural. A tense, electric stillness clung to the air as midnight approached. The guards patrolled the area, their flashlights piercing the darkness, yet the perimeter cameras showed no unusual activity. Inside the guest house, Emma lay wide awake, her ears straining for any sound beyond Pamela's soft, rhythmic breathing. Suddenly, the lights in the guest house flickered. Emma's stomach dropped as a faint metallic click echoed through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. At the main house, Walter was reviewing the security monitors when he noticed movement. A dark shape darting across the lawn, just beyond the light's reach. "Sir," he said urgently, leaning toward Matthew, who had been pacing nearby. "We have activity." Matthew moved to the monitor, his jaw tightening as he recognized the unmistakable figure of Martin leading 3 other men across the grounds. Their movements were deliberate, calculated, as if they knew the patrol schedule. "Sound the alarm," Matthew said, already heading for the door. "And call the police." Walter grabbed his phone, his calm composure intact, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his actions. Emma's hand hovered over Pamela's crib as she debated what to do. The muffled voices outside the guest house reached her ears. One was unmistakably Martin. "Inside," he hissed. "Keep it quiet. We don't need to wake the whole place." The front door rattled, and Emma acted. She scooped Pamela into her arms and bolted for the bathroom, locking the door behind her. Her breaths came in short gasps as she clutched her daughter close, her mind racing. The sound of a window shattering tore through the night. Matthew reached the guest house just as the intruders forced their way inside. The crash of breaking glass and heavy footsteps met him as he stepped through the door. His eyes scanned the room, catching sight of Martin barking orders to the others. "Stay out of this, Matthew," Martin warned, his voice a mix of fear and bravado. "This isn't about you." Matthew didn't hesitate. "You're not taking them," he said, his voice cold and firm. One of the thugs lunged at Matthew, and the fight erupted. The sound of fists and furniture breaking filled the small space. Matthew held his own, but the numbers weren't in his favor. A sharp blow to his ribs sent him stumbling, but he stayed between the men and the hallway leading to Emma and Pamela. In the bathroom, Emma covered Pamela's ears as tears streamed down her face. She could hear the chaos outside, the crashes, the shouts, and the unmistakable sound of Matthew's voice. He was fighting for them. Her fear morphed into determination. She looked around the small room, her eyes landing on a heavy ceramic soap dish. It wasn't much, but it was something. Matthew was cornered, his breathing labored as the thugs closed in. Martin hovered near the door, his face pale but resolute. "Let's end this," Martin said, signaling one of the men forward. Before the thug could act, the bathroom door burst open. Emma emerged, Pamela bundled tightly in one arm, her other hand gripping the soap dish. She threw it with surprising force, striking one of the attackers squarely in the head. The man staggered, and Matthew seized the moment. He lunged, knocking another to the ground. Emma darted past Martin, her focus solely on reaching the main house. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. Walter's quick call to the police had paid off. The remaining intruders panicked, their confidence evaporating as the sound grew louder. Martin hesitated, torn between fleeing and finishing the job. His moment of indecision cost him. Matthew, bloodied but unbroken, tackled him to the ground. The two struggled briefly before the police stormed the guest house, shouting orders. Within moments, the intruders were subdued, their wrists bound with zip ties as they were dragged away. Emma stood in the main house, clutching Pamela tightly as Walter reassured her. When Matthew staggered in, his shirt torn and blood staining his side. Emma ran to him. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. Her hands fluttered over his injuries, unsure where to start. "I'm fine," Matthew said, his voice hoarse. But his exhaustion was evident. "You're not fine," Emma shot back, her fear morphing into anger. "You could have been killed." Matthew met her gaze, his expression soft despite the pain. "I told you," he said quietly. "I'd protect you." Her tears fell freely now. "I didn't want you to get hurt because of me." Matthew shook his head. "This isn't your fault." Walter reappeared with a first aid kit, gently guiding Matthew to sit. As Emma helped tend to his wounds, her touch careful and deliberate, the unspoken connection between them deepened. The chaos of the night faded into the background, replaced by a fragile but undeniable sense of safety. Outside, the estate was alive with activity, flashing lights, police officers taking statements, and the distant hum of engines. But within the walls of the main house, there was quiet. Not peace, but something close. Emma sat beside Matthew, Pamela asleep in her arms. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything." Matthew didn't respond immediately. He leaned back, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but a faint smile played on his lips. "It's not over yet," he said, "but we'll get through it. Together." The sterile brightness of the hospital room felt both comforting and overwhelming. Emma sat in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on Matthew. He lay on the bed, a bandage wrapped around his ribs and a faint bruise darkening his cheek. Despite his injuries, his steady breathing was a relief, a reminder that he was alive. Pamela stirred softly in Emma's arms, her tiny fingers curling against her mother's chest. Emma adjusted her daughter's blanket absent-mindedly, her focus never leaving Matthew. Each rise and fall of his chest was a reassurance, yet the sight of his injuries filled her with guilt. When Matthew stirred, his eyes fluttering open, Emma was at his side instantly. "You're awake," she said softly, relief flooding her voice. Matthew's gaze met hers, and he offered a faint, tired smile. "Guess I'm not indestructible after all." A laugh escaped Emma, though it sounded more like a sob. "That's not funny," she said, her voice trembling. "You could have been—" "I'm still here," he interrupted gently, his hand reaching out to cover hers. "And so are you. That's what matters." Emma squeezed his hand, her fingers trembling. "You didn't have to do all this, Matthew. You didn't have to put yourself in danger for us." He frowned, his expression firm, despite his exhaustion. "Of course I did. I promised to protect you and Pamela. But I brought this into your life," she said, her voice breaking. "If it weren't for me, none of this would have happened." Matthew's grip tightened. "Emma, stop," he said firmly. "This isn't your fault. None of it. The people who hurt you, who hurt me, they're the ones to blame." Tears welled in Emma's eyes. "You almost died." "And I'd do it again," Matthew said simply, "if it meant keeping you and Pamela safe." The nurse entered quietly, checking Matthew's vitals and leaving just as quickly. As the door clicked shut, Emma adjusted the blanket over Matthew, her movements gentle and deliberate. "Is it painful?" she inquired, her voice barely audible over a whisper. Matthew chuckled softly. "Only when I breathe." Emma glared at him, but the corners of her mouth tugged upward despite herself. "You're impossible." "And you're still here," Matthew countered, his tone softening. "That means something." Emma looked away, her gaze drifting to the window. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her voice distant, "to always feel like you're looking over your shoulder. To wonder when the past will catch up with you. Matthew reached out, his fingers brushing hers. You're not alone anymore, Emma. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she let herself believe him. Later that afternoon, Matthew was discharged. Walter was waiting with the car, his composed demeanor masking the relief he felt seeing Matthew upright, albeit moving gingerly. Emma sat beside him during the ride back to the estate, Pamela asleep in her arms. The silence between them was not strained, but reflective, heavy with unspoken emotions. Back at the estate, Walter had prepared a quiet corner in the main house for Matthew to recover. The guest house remained untouched, its broken window a stark reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. Emma hovered nearby, fussing over pillows and blankets, ensuring Matthew was comfortable. "You don't have to fuss," Matthew said, his voice tinged with amusement. "I owe you that much," Emma replied, her tone resolute. Matthew watched her, his expression softening. "You don't owe me anything." Emma paused, her hands stilling. "I do," she said quietly. "You've done more for me and Pamela than anyone else ever has. You've given us a chance to feel safe again." Matthew's voice was gentle but firm. "Emma, you've been through hell. All I've done is help. You didn't deserve any of this." Emma turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And you didn't deserve to get hurt because of me." "Some things are worth getting hurt for," Matthew said, his gaze steady. "You and Pamela are worth it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emma sat down beside him, her hands folding into her lap. "I don't know how to thank you," she said after a long silence. "You already have," Matthew replied, "by staying." That evening, the estate was quiet, the tension of the past few days giving way to a fragile calm. Emma sat beside Matthew, Pamela nestled between them. The baby's soft coos filled the room, a soothing counterpoint to the silence. Emma glanced at Matthew, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began, her voice hesitant, "when this is all over, I hope I can find a way to move forward, to give Pamela a life where she doesn't have to grow up with this fear." "You will," Matthew said with quiet conviction, "and I'll be there to help, for as long as you'll let me." Emma's breath hitched, and she looked away, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his words. But she didn't pull back when Matthew reached for her hand, his touch steady and reassuring. For the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to feel something other than fear. Hope. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the warm light of the law office. Matthew sat across from his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara who radiated competence. She leafed through a thick folder of papers, her lips pressed into a tight line as she read. "We have enough here to file a restraining order against Martin," Clara said, setting the folder down. "Given his involvement in the break-in and his history of coercion, the courts should grant it without much resistance." Matthew nodded, his expression grim. "What about charges for the break-in itself?" "Those are already in motion," Clara assured him. "The DA will eventually take action based on the evidence you and Walter have provided. Martin won't get out of this easily." Emma, seated beside Matthew, shifted uncomfortably. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. "And the others?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Clara's sharp gaze softened slightly. "We are still identifying the rest of the group. The men who broke into the estate are cooperating minimally, but the police are piecing it together. As for the individuals tied to your father," she hesitated, glancing at Matthew, "that will be harder to address. They're elusive, and their connections run deep." Emma's shoulders sagged, and she looked down at her hands. "They won't stop," she murmured, "not until they've gotten what they want." Matthew reached over, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "We'll deal with them," he said firmly. "Step by step." Back at the estate, Emma felt a strange sense of calm as she tucked Pamela into bed. The legal discussions had been heavy, but there was something liberating about finally confronting the mess of her past. Matthew's unwavering support gave her strength she hadn't realized she had. The next day, with Matthew's encouragement, Emma visited a small local business that was hiring for part-time work. The manager, a kind woman named Janice, was charmed by Emma's quiet determination and immediately offered her a position. Emma felt a spark of hope as she began to imagine a life for her and Pamela that wasn't defined by fear. Matthew watched Emma blossom over the next few weeks. Though the estate remained heavily guarded and the shadow of Douglas's enemies lingered, there were moments of joy. He often found Emma and Pamela in the garden, their laughter ringing out like a balm against the tension. One evening, as Matthew joined them for dinner, Emma set down her fork and looked at him. "I got the job," she said, her voice tinged with pride and disbelief. "It's not much, but it's something." Matthew smiled, genuine and warm. "It's a start, and you're rebuilding. That's what matters." Emma's gaze softened. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," Matthew replied. "This is you, Emma. I'm just here to help." But the peace was fragile. Late one evening, as Emma stepped out to the garden for fresh air, she noticed a figure lingering near the estate's edge, just beyond the reach of the floodlights. The man didn't approach, but stood watching, his stance casual, yet menacing. Her breath caught as their eyes met briefly before he turned and disappeared into the darkness. When she told Matthew, his face darkened. "We'll increase security," he said immediately, his tone firm. "They're getting closer," Emma said, her voice trembling. "They're testing us." "And we'll be ready," Matthew assured her. That night, as Emma lay awake, her thoughts churned. The encounter with the man had been brief, but it was enough to dredge up memories she had tried to bury. The faces of her father's enemies, the whispered threats she had overheard as a child, all came rushing back. But then she thought of Pamela, her tiny laugh and bright eyes. She thought of Matthew, his unwavering strength and kindness, and she resolved to keep fighting. For Pamela, for herself, and for the life she was starting to believe they could have. The courtroom was packed with tension, the hum of whispers filling the air as the judge entered and the proceedings began. Emma sat in the front row, Pamela cradled in her lap, her small hand clutching the edge of Emma's sweater. Beside them, Matthew exuded quiet strength, his presence a steadying anchor. Martin sat at the defendant's table, his usual bravado diminished. His shoulders slumped, and his gaze darted nervously toward the judge as the charges were read aloud. Breaking and entering, conspiracy, coercion, and endangerment. The weight of his actions finally bore down on him, and there was no escape. The judge's gavel struck, and the verdict was delivered. Guilty. Martin's sentence was swift and decisive. Years behind bars, a restraining order ensuring he could never come near Emma or Pamela again. The sense of finality was palpable, like a cord snapping under tension. As they left the courtroom, Emma's steps felt lighter, though her hands still trembled. Outside, she turned to Matthew, her voice quiet. "It's over." "Part of it," he corrected gently, "but it's a start." The warm sunlight bathed the estate as they returned home. The tension that had gripped the property for weeks seemed to dissipate under the golden glow. The reinforced security measures, while still present, felt less like a fortress and more like a safeguard. Walter greeted them at the door, his ever-composed demeanor softening with genuine relief. "Welcome back, Miss White, Mr. Langston." "Thank you, Walter," Emma said, her smile tentative but real. That afternoon, Emma joined Matthew in the garden, where Pamela toddled after butterflies, her laughter ringing out like music. Emma watched her daughter, her heart swelling with gratitude. "She's happy," she said softly. "She's safe," Matthew added, his voice carrying a weight of conviction. Emma turned to him, her gaze searching. "Matthew, I don't know how to begin thanking you for everything." He shook his head, his eyes steady on hers. "You don't have to. This is where you belong, Emma. You and Pamela." Her breath hitched, but she nodded. "I want to rebuild, not just for Pamela, but for myself too. I want a life where we're not just surviving." "You already are," Matthew said. "Look at her." He gestured to Pamela, who was now chasing a butterfly with uncontainable glee. "She's thriving because of you." "And you," Emma added, her voice trembling slightly. "You've done so much for us." Matthew stepped closer, his expression soft but earnest. "I didn't do this for thanks. I did it because I care about you, about Pamela." The words hung in the air, charged with meaning. Emma's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she reached for his hand, her touch hesitant but firm. "I care about you too," she whispered. The connection between them solidified, unspoken but undeniable. They stood there for a long moment, the sunlight warming their skin, the world around them fading into the background. That evening, the three of them sat on the patio as the sun dipped below the horizon. Pamela had fallen asleep in Emma's arms, her tiny face serene. Emma leaned into Matthew, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. "This feels like a beginning," Emma said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Not an end." "It is," Matthew replied, his voice low. "The beginning of something better." The estate, once shrouded in shadows of fear and danger, now felt like a sanctuary. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Emma allowed herself a moment of peace, the kind she had long believed was out of reach. Together, they had faced the past. Together, they would build a future. And for the first time in years, Emma felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.